Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all doing really well today. So it is a new year and I thought this would be a good time to make a video for those of you who might be interested with getting started with making your own clothes this year. So I've been making my own clothes for the past several years and I find it to be such a rewarding process. I love seeing how something goes from being an idea to being an actual piece of clothing. So today I put together 6 different steps that I think you will find really helpful if you're wanting to get started yourself. So let's go ahead and jump into those 6 steps. Really quickly before we do though, if you are new to my channel, my name is Lauren and I make videos about sewing, knitting, and thrifting my wardrobe. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, you can go ahead and subscribe by clicking the button down below and I would really appreciate it. But let's go ahead and jump right in. So the first step I would take to get started with making your own clothing is to find a basic sewing machine. This doesn't have to be expensive and it doesn't have to have a lot of bells and whistles. You just want something basic that you can get started with. Be sure to check with family and friends too, because I've been surprised by how many sewing machines I've accumulated just because people know I sew. So reach out to your community and see if anyone has one they might let you borrow or just be interested in giving away. I love using vintage sewing machines. They have all of the basic things that you need and they're also really heavy duty. But if you're looking to purchase a new one, I would start with a basic model by Brother, Genome, or Singer. Those are all pretty solid brands. You want to look for a basic machine that can do, of course, the basic straight stitch. That's what we will use to construct most of our garments. You also want to look for something that can do a zigzag stitch. That looks like little triangles going back and forth, and that will come in really handy for making the inside of your garments look nice and neat. And then you also want to look for a machine that can do basic buttonholes, because you might decide you want to make something that buttons, and so those will be necessary for that. But really with those 3 basic things, you are good to go. So right now I use a vintage Kenmore sewing machine that I got from my grandmother. I absolutely love this machine and it does all of the things I need it to do. I also use an overlocker machine and that will create that seam that you see inside professionally made clothing that comes from the store, but you definitely don't need that to get started. When I was starting with making my own clothing, I just used that basic zigzag stitch on my seams and that worked just as well. So I wouldn't worry about getting an overlocker if you're just getting started with making your own clothes. Just start with that basic machine. Now, once you have your sewing machine, it's time to learn how to use it and practice some basic techniques. The first thing I would do is have a quick read through the owner's manual of your machine and also watch some basic YouTube tutorials with that specific machine. You can just look up the model on YouTube and you'll usually find someone showing how to thread the machine or do basic techniques with the machine. And speaking of threading the machine, you want to learn how to thread your bobbin and thread your machine. This is pretty similar on most sewing machines, so I'm going to show you how I do that on my sewing machine now.
First, thread the bobbin. Oh, that must be it. It's bobbing up and down.
So to get started with threading the bobbin on this machine, first I'm just going to loop my thread through this little circular piece here in the front. Now I'm going to take my bobbin, and you can see this has all of these little holes in the top. I'm going to just put the thread through one of the holes in the bobbin. And then here on the opposite side of the machine is where I need to place my bobbin in order to wind the thread onto it. So I'm just going to snap that down, and then on my machine you push this little lever closed. Most sewing machines will have a switch to keep the needle from running up and down while you're winding the bobbin. On mine, I just pull this out, and then I can just press on the pedal to start winding the thread onto the bobbin. Once it's pretty secure, I'm going to go ahead and cut this top thread. And now I can just let it wind until it's finished. Then I can just remove the bobbin and go ahead and cut the thread. Now, adding the bobbin to the sewing machine is a little bit more complicated on this vintage machine. It won't be as complicated if you're working with a newer one. So mine has this bobbin case that I have to put the bobbin into. Usually on a more modern machine, you'll just set the bobbin in place. But for this, I want to make sure that my bobbin with the thread looks like the letter P. And I'm not sure if this is reversing on the camera, hopefully not. So I want to make sure that the tail is on the left side of the bobbin, and then I can go ahead and place this in the case. And then on mine, I just pull the thread around to the side like this. And then making sure that my sewing machine needle is in the highest position, I can go ahead and snap this into the sewing machine. So now let's get the sewing machine threaded. I still have my thread wrapped around that top part of the machine, and I'm going to hook it through this loop here. Then I'm going to wrap it around in between these metal pieces on the circular part of the machine. And then it's just kind of following along. So I'm going to go through this section, this loop here, and then there are 2 hooks near the needle of the machine that my thread needs to go around. So now all I have to do is thread the needle. So I'm just going to do that now and make sure that none of my thread is tangled along the way. And then I'm just going to pull this back behind the presser foot, which is this little part of the sewing machine. So now I'm going to take the wheel on the side of my sewing machine and move the needle up and down to pull the bobbin thread up through the sewing machine. And now you can see I have these 2 threads extended out of the back. So now I can close everything up and let's see if it sews. I have some test fabric here, so I'm just going to sew in a straight line. And that looks pretty good. So with your sewing machine threaded, you're ready to actually use it, which is exciting. And the way I recommend you start practicing is by drawing some lines that are straight lines and curved lines on paper or on fabric. And you can just try tracing those lines with your stitching. It's a really easy way to practice sewing in a straight line. It seems easy, but it can be a little tricky to get started with. So making those lines on the paper or fabric will just give you a guideline that you can work with. And then you'll find as you practice that it becomes really second nature and straightforward. You also want to learn how to do a basic back stitch. A back stitch just means you go backwards and forwards with your stitching, and this secures your seam at the beginning and the end so that it doesn't come unraveled. So on my machine, there's a lever that I push down and that causes the stitching to go backwards. And I just do that backwards and forwards a couple of times until the stitching is really secure. Then I can continue with my seam. It's a little bit different on other sewing machines, but the same basic idea. So you just want to check your owner's manual to see how you do the back stitch on your machine. And then the last thing I would recommend you practice before you get started with a project is using that zigzag or overlocking stitch on the edge of some fabric, and that will just get you ready to sew some basic seams. But once you can do a basic straight seam, some curved seams, and then also back stitching and overlocking, you are ready to get started with your first project. So now that you're ready to get started with your first project, don't be over ambitious. Start small and choose something really simple. Look for a tutorial or project that has a minimal number of pieces and straight seams and straight lines. That's going to be a lot easier to get started with. And you want to choose something that you can feel really successful with and proud of your accomplishment when you're done. So don't shoot straight for the most complicated project you can imagine. Go for something easy at first. A couple of things I would recommend are a pillow or pillowcase. Those are simple because the seams are just straight seams, or an apron. That's something that's pretty easy to start with as well. Again, straight seams, and there's different styles that you can make. So those are some good places to get started and really practice those basic skills. And as you practice on this basic project, you'll really be building your confidence and feel successful with the resulting project. You want to work with a fabric that's easy to work with. So I would recommend something like a quilting cotton. Quilting cotton is 100% cotton, and you can find it at most fabric stores or craft stores, and it's also pretty affordable. But if you don't want to buy something new, try using some old linens or sheets. That can be a good way to find a lot of fabric for a cheap price, especially at the thrift stores. So try that out and find some easy to work with fabric that you can get started with. So once you've made your first project, maybe you've made a really cute pillowcase or an apron or something like that, you are ready to learn how to use a sewing pattern. And a lot of people find these to be really intimidating, but once you break it down, it's not too bad. So let's go over the basics of how you use and read one of these sewing patterns. You can find sewing patterns a lot of different places. You can find them at fabric and craft stores. There are also some amazing brands online. I'm going to use a simplicity pattern here just to show you how these are basically formatted. It might be slightly different from each brand that you look at, but the basic principles remain the same. So this type of pattern comes in a pattern envelope, and then when you look at the back, this is when it suddenly looks a little bit complicated, but it's not too bad. So it will give you recommendations for the type of fabric you want to use for the project, and it will also tell you what notions you need. Notions just mean the extra things you need to make the project. So for this pair of pajama pants, you need thread, buttons, and some elastics. So those are just some extra things that you would need to pick up. And then it also gives you a measurement chart. It tells you the different body measurements for the different sizes. This particular pattern is sizes extra small to extra large. You may also see numerical sizes, and keep in mind that with most sewing patterns, the numerical sizes are very different from the dress size you would see in the store. So if I were starting with this pattern as my first sewing pattern, the first thing I would do is check my measurements and see which size they correspond to so that I know which size to choose. And then when you open up the pattern, you're going to find a few different things. You're going to find the tissue that has the actual pattern printed on it. Mine is all cut up from this particular pattern, but all of these patterns come in multi-sized options, so there will be a different line you cut on corresponding to the size that you choose. It's pretty easy to do. And then there will also be a pattern guide or sewing directions, and this is where you will find your step-by-step instructions. So this little pattern guide will give you a list of everything you need to do. It will also show you a layout of how you need to lay out your pattern pieces to fit on the fabric, and also show you what pieces are included in the particular design. This may not be showing up too well on my camera, so I'll show you some close-ups of how this works. So really with patterns, it's just finding your size and then finding the pieces that you need to cut out on the fabric. Once you have that, then it's just following those step-by-step instructions and looking up the terminology along the way if you find something you're confused by. Now, one more thing that's important that I forgot to mention is when you're looking at the size, you will also find the information for how much fabric you need. Now, I'm in the US, so I work in yards for my fabric. If you're elsewhere, you might use meters, but looking at this particular pattern, if I look on the back, I'll see the size medium corresponds to 2.5 yards of fabric if that fabric is 45 inches wide, or 2 yards of fabric if that fabric is 60 inches wide. When you go to a fabric store, that will be listed on the outside of the bolt of fabric, and if you look online, it will also be listed in the description of the fabric, so you can see what the width of your fabric is and determine how much you need to get started with your project. So now that you know a little bit about how to read a sewing pattern, you're ready to choose a pattern for your first project. And I would choose a pattern that is pretty basic. Look for something that doesn't have a ton of seams, that is not super fitted. You don't want it to have so many pattern pieces that you feel overwhelmed as you're cutting out your first project. So there are 3 basic styles that I would recommend when it comes to a first clothing project, and those are a basic A-line skirt, a simple tank top, or a pair of pajama bottoms. And I have 3 patterns that I recommend that are really good for all 3 of these projects. First up is a basic pair of pajama pants, and this is the pattern we were looking at just a minute ago. This one is from Simplicity Patterns, and this is number 8518. I got this at Joann Fabrics, and it's a really simple pattern to sew, but it does have some cute details. And sewing a pair of pajama bottoms can be a really good way to practice because it's not necessarily something that you're wearing out, but you can make something comfy for wearing at home, so it can be a good first project for that reason. Then another project that I'd recommend is the Ginger Skirt from Seamwork Patterns. This is a basic A-line skirt, and it has 3 variations that have different waistband styles, which are really fun. So you could start with the most simple one and maybe make one that's a little bit more fun and different. But these types of skirts are great to start with because the only fitting that you really have to be concerned about is the waist. So that makes it pretty simple to start with, but you'll also learn how to sew a zipper in with the instructions in one of these patterns. And then the last pattern that I would recommend is also from Seamwork, and this is the Sorbito tank top. This is a digital download that I have, so I don't have it to show you to you physically, but this is a really great tank top to start with because it is really simple and it's just fitted with 2 darts in the front, and then it also pulls over your head so there's no closures to sew, which makes it a little bit more simple. So those are 3 patterns that I recommend for your first project, and you want to choose something that you're going to be able to get through and feel really accomplished at the end of. And finally, just plan to have fun and be creative. There are only so many aspects of sewing that I can cover in one short YouTube video, but I hope if you take anything away from this video, it would just be to get started. Get some fabric, get some patterns, make a really creative mess, and have fun with sewing. One of the best things about sewing is once you get started, it just evolves into your own hobby and your own craft. So really make it what you want it to be and get started with it and have fun. There's nothing like being able to make your own clothing, and I find it to be such a rewarding hobby. So I really hope you'll give it a try and enjoy it as much as I do. Now, if you stuck around to this point in the video, I assume that you're really interested in getting started with making your own clothes. So I have a couple of book recommendations to show you that I found really helpful myself as I was getting started, and hopefully you will as well. The first one is the Colette Sewing Handbook, and I think this is only really available at bookstores and on Amazon right now. I don't think they have it available on their website, but I find this book to be such a great resource. I still use it today when I'm looking up different techniques because There is so much information in here about fitting, about basic techniques. Here's a page on how to set in a sleeve, and the picture tutorials are really clear as well. So this is super helpful. And then it also includes basic patterns to get started with. So if you're looking for something that you could really work through step by step, I would really recommend this book because you could work through each of the patterns included and get all of the information from the written portion of the book. So it's a great place to get started. And then one more book that is along the same lines is Love at First Stitch by Tilly from the blog Tilly and the Buttons. And this one is another great resource if you're wanting to get started. There's a lot of basic information, and I would say that this one is slightly lower level than the Colette Sewing Handbook, so maybe a little bit easier to read as you're going through it if you're not familiar with sewing terminology. And then again, this one has a lot of adorable patterns in it as well. So again, you could use it in the same way of working through all of the patterns, and the designs in here are so cute. They're a little bit more retro in style, and I love just the styling of each design in this book. So that is all that I have for you guys today, but if you have any specific questions or ideas of video topics you'd like me to cover in the future, please let me know in a comment down below and I will do my best to get back to you. And if you're an experienced sewer watching this video, let me know what I left out so that we can help the whole community in the comments down below as well. Thank you guys so much for watching and spending your time here on my channel today. I hope this was helpful, and I'll talk to you in a new sewing video very, very soon. Bye!
Different than all the rest. I'm quite old-fashioned, wear a hat, sometimes play